Crash Bandicoot, our favorite mutated marsupial, is making his long-awaited return to video games with another crate-smashing, Wumpa-fruit-eating, Aku mask-wearing entry into the Crash Bandicoot action platformer series with Crash Bandicoot 4. It's about time. And yes, it is about time, Crash. We missed you. Crash 4 serves as a direct sequel to Crash Bandicoot Warped, the third entry in the Crash Bandicoot series. Now, I know everyone is probably wondering the same thing I'm wondering. What does that mean for the 4 action platformers that preceded the latest Crash game? I'm, of course, talking about Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, Crash to Insanity, Crash of the Titans, and least we forget Crash Mind Over Mutant. With Crash 4 being a direct sequel to Crash Warped, are those games simply just erased from Crash history? Well, not necessarily. With all the time-twisting Crash and his sister Coco have done, trying to follow the timeline of these Bandicoots isn't an easy task. And now that they're playing within the realm of the Multiverse with this latest entry, the Crash Prime universe has gotten a whole hell of a lot more complicated. So naturally, I decided it'd be a great idea to break down the timeline of Crash Bandicoot.
How many times have you beaten this clown anyway?
3.
Really? Only 3? Funny. Seemed like more.
It all started back in 1996 with the original Crash Bandicoot, which were simpler times for our boy Crash. He had one goal in mind, simply to traverse the many perils found on the Wumpa Islands to save his girlfriend Tawna, who was being held captive by the evil Dr. Neo Cortex in Cortex Castle. Now, if the premise of saving a damsel in distress being held captive in a towering castle by a big baddie sounds familiar, well, it shouldn't. It's not like, we've seen this play out in Super Mario Brothers or anything. Okay, maybe we have, but clearly, the Crash Bandicoot franchise isn't above poking fun of itself or even the subtle comparisons that would be made of him to that of a certain plumber boy.
Hey, plumber boy, mustache man, your worst nightmare has arrived.
A year later in 1997, we got Crash Bandicoot 2, Cortex Strikes Back. Now at this time, the Crash Bandicoot story is still pretty straightforward. You got the mad scientist trying to trick the protag into helping him carry out his evil plans of world domination by turning every creature on Earth into mindless slaves using his Cortex Vortex. In Crash 2, Cortex Strikes Back, Crash and his sister Coco thwart Dr. Neo Cortex's plan again by using Dr. Nitrous Brio's, or Embryo's, laser to destroy Cortex's space station. Now, it's not until 1998's Crash Bandicoot Warped that we start to see some wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey activity going on in the Crash Prime universe. In Warped, we're introduced to Dr. Entropy's time-twisting machine. Now, for those of you who may not be too familiar with Dr. Entropy, he's yet another evil scientist in the franchise's long and storied history of cleverly named villains with a PhD. His particular focus, though, is space and time travel. But unlike Dr. Emmett Brown, who travels through time to fix things that are slightly askew, this doc purposefully causes time paradoxes just for the giggles.
Great Scott!
So he naturally joins forces with Aku's evil brother Uka Uka and Dr. Neo Cortex to assist him in collecting magical crystals from different periods of time to harness their powers for evil. Collecting crystals, transforming animals into evil minions. I don't know, kind of sounds like another doctor that I know. Yeah, it totally does. Now Cortex, Uka Uka, and Entropy are a team, an evil team, trying to collect the various gems and crystals from different pockets of time. Coco, Crash, and Aku hop through space and time themselves to collect the crystals and gems before the evil trio do. Ultimately, they manage to cause the Time Twister to implode, hurling Uka Uka, Cortex, and Trophy back in time, thus saving the day. Uka Uka is yet again a prisoner of time, and the two evil scientists are last seen as harmless, adorable, yet well-spoken babies. Aww.
Give me the mask! With it I shall take over the world!
Now with those 3 lost in time, they're no longer a threat, or so we're led to believe. This is where the rift in our current Crash Bandicoot mythos occurs. It's About Time is the direct follow-up to Warped, negating every single thing that occurred in 2001's Crash Bandicoot The Wrath of Cortex, the original 4th Crash game. So if The Wrath of Cortex didn't happen after Warped, does that mean the following 3 games didn't as well? Well, not exactly. See, multiple timelines could have been created when the Time Twister in Warped imploded, hurling the villains back in time, thus disrupting the very fabric of the multiverse. It's more than likely that the events of The Wrath of Cortex and its following games could exist in an alternate timeline or parallel universe, given the synopsis of It's About Time. 2020's Crash 4 heralds the return of Dr. Neo Cortex and Dr. Entropy, who somehow found their way back from their interdimensional prison, creating a rift in the space-time continuum while doing so. Now this time around, they're looking to conquer every dimension. That's right, baby, we're talking about the multiverse. Crash and his little sister Coco have now entered into a Crisis on Infinite Earths threat level scenario. Now what does that mean? Well, that means Crash will now have to traverse multiple dimensions, find the quantum masks, the 4 ancient witch doctors who hold dominion over space and time, defeat Dr. Neo Cortex and Dr. Entropy yet again, and restore peace not only to his dimension, but the many parallel dimensions in the Crash universe. Sounds simple enough, right? I guess. I don't know. I've never traveled in time, only forward by sleeping and just natural progression of time. Now, this is probably Crash's biggest adventure yet, and definitely the one with the most at stake. If he fails here, not only is his reality at jeopardy, the reality of the many Crash Bandicoots out there in the multiverse are as well. Now, one of the unique things this game does is it brings the multiverse into play, which in other media has been used to acknowledge the existence of other variations of the same character. Now, we've seen this done in the CW's The Flash and their Crisis on Infinite Earths run, where we see the movie version of The Flash, played by Ezra Miller, cross paths with his small screen counterpart. They're even billing the upcoming Flash movie as a sort of soft reboot of the DCEU. Now, you might be able to say the same for It's About Time in the Crash universe. It's About Time succeeds where The Wrath of Cortex failed, in that it acknowledges the ending of Crash 3. The Wrath of Cortex, the original 4th entry, doesn't address what happened to Uka Uka, Cortex, or Entropy at the end of Crash 3. It simply starts with some weird roundtable meeting with Uka Uka calling out the other villains for sucking at being villains.
Uka Uka, it's not our fault. That wretched Bandicoot is to blame.
Seeing this in this particular game really presented many questions, like how did Neo Cortex and Entropy become adults again after we last saw them as babies in a prehistoric pocket of time? And wasn't Cortex's space station destroyed by Embryo's laser and warped? Naughty Dog, the original developers of the first 3 Crash games, left Universal Interactive after the development and release of Crash Team Racing back in 1999. Universal held the rights to the Crash Bandicoot series, and although he's a marsupial, well, they knew they had a cash cow on their hands that they were gonna milk for every single penny. So they continued to make games using his likeness. Continuity was probably like the last thing on their minds, which is why there's no real connective tissue to the ending of the 3rd Crash game. Well, what Toys for Bob have done with exploring the multiverse in It's About Time is acknowledge both the original Crash trilogy and the 4 action platformers that followed. Within this multiverse timeline, Crash Bandicoot: The Wrath of Cortex, Crash Twinsanity, Crash of the Titans, and Crash Mind Over Mutant are all scenarios that did in fact take place, just not in the Crash Prime universe. So that explains all the inconsistencies we see in the games that followed Warped, even the way Crash and Aku Aku looked in Mind Over Mutant. Look at that, you gave tattoos to Crash? And what the hell is up with Aku Aku's face? He don't look like that. So the timeline of Crash Bandicoot plays out as follows. You got Crash 1 through 3, which all happen relatively back to back. Then the time paradox that occurs in Warped that sends the 3 villains back in time. We see a split within realities, where the Wrath of Cortex, Crash Twinsanity, Crash of the Titans, and Mind Over Mutant all happen. Then, in the Crash Prime universe, actual time has passed, which leads us to the events in It's About Time. So, It's About Time serves as the bridge between the original 3 games and the 4 that preceded it by playing within the multiverse. That's one way of looking at it, as opposed to, just simply disavowing the previous 4 games. While some of them weren't that good, they did have some redeeming elements that I personally really appreciated, like Crunch Bandicoot.
Thank you for believing in me, guys.
Well, hopefully you came out of this video less confused about the timeline of Crash Bandicoot, or I don't know, maybe you have more questions because of it. Either way, let's just be happy that Crash is back after such a long-ass hiatus. Would love to know your thoughts on this. Let's please discuss it down below. And also, guys, which of the Crash games were your favorite? Comment down below. Let's talk about it. And for more confusing Crash content, check out this video about my joint-wearing boy here. And for all other coverage, keep it right here on IGN.